Welcome back. We're rocking and rolling off to our second panel now, as John hinted, facilitating and evaluating public discourse. And we have three panelists, Kelly Hogan, who represents the Office of Instructional Innovation and also the Department of Biology. Second, Lloyd Kramer, who represents Carolina Public Humanities and the Department of History. And finally, Michael Vazquez from the Parr Center for Ethics and the Department of Philosophy.
So thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Kevin and John and others at the Program for Public Discourse for organizing this symposium. And I'm honored to participate in discussion what I think is a really important issue about public discourse and the world beyond the university as well. I teach in the history department, but as director of Carolina Public Humanities, I am very much interested in how we can connect faculty as well as students with people throughout the state of North Carolina. So this is what I'm doing a lot of in my work these days. In fact, I feel like it's taken over as my passion. So I'm glad to talk about this. Our panel discussion has been described as an opportunity to talk about how faculty can administer and grade public discourse effectively. And I confess that grading student contributions to public discourse is not the main point of my effort, as I try to encourage involvement with public events and public debates, public conflicts. I think, like most faculty, I find that grading papers or grading oral presentations is probably the least appealing part of our work. I say that as I'm about to pile through another big stack of papers today, so I think you can all relate to this feeling. But I do love to engage students in discussions of ideas and big issues, even if I feel somewhat sapped by grading, or I worry about the fairness of how I grade or my evaluations, and that's a big issue for me. But I want to use this opportunity to explain why I believe it's important to help students develop their own abilities to facilitate and evaluate public discourse. And I'm going to share my screen. I hope this will come through clearly. So what I want to do is just say a little bit about why I think this really matters, why it's important to facilitate and evaluate public discourse. And then I'm going to say something about how I'm trying to promote this work through my seminars, especially first-year seminars, and also in a program of Carolina Public Humanities that fosters graduate student involvement with people outside the university. Because I thought Charlotte made a really good point about how we're all acculturated as scholars, and I think we also need to intervene at the graduate student level to help students rethink what it means to be an academic. But I want to begin by just referring briefly to the ongoing debates about why students go to college. And these are all familiar to us. We've all encountered them. But for me, they're the starting point for everything I'm trying to do in terms of engagement with public discourse. So among the many arguments that people use, there are, I think, at least three especially important arguments about the purpose of higher education for students. And I think all three arguments help to explain what students can gain from a university education, and also all of these arguments can be linked to the pedagogical work that fosters engagement with public discourse. Every one of these arguments is linked to public discourse. So the most popular utilitarian argument for a university education, of course, focuses on how it gives students practical skills to get a good job and lifetime income, good income. We're all familiar with that argument. We all engage it in one way or another. The second argument focuses on how a university education gives students the knowledge and analytical skills they need to participate in civic life and a democratic political culture. And this argument, I think, has become increasingly important during an era when anti-democratic leaders and ideologies are spreading across contemporary political cultures and the internet. I think John ended the last session by saying why are these issues important now? And I think anybody who cares about democracy needs to pay attention to this. And then the third argument for why university education matters for students is that it gives them perspectives and knowledge they need to live a meaningful life, to have meaningful work, to cope with the inevitable challenges of the human condition, and how they can find the talents they'll need for work, no matter what kind of work they do, every kind of profession, every kind of career. And this argument, of course, how to gain knowledge for a meaningful life and work, has always been at the heart of the argument for a liberal arts education. So we could come back to any of these themes, but I think all three are related to the argument that public discourse needs to be part of our analysis as professors and students. So I want to refer to two authors who have been guiding my own thinking as I design coursework and also as I organize programs for Carolina Public Humanities. One is this person on the right, Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher at the University of Chicago, who writes many books, but wrote an important book about 10 years ago called Not for Profit: Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And the other important book is by Michael Roth, who is currently the president of Wesleyan University, Why Liberal Education Matters. It was published in 2014. I think both of these books are extremely helpful for faculty who are trying to understand why we need to engage with public discourse and public issues. I'm going to take the time to just look at what they have to say. I know this takes a minute, but I think it's really important. This is Martha Nussbaum's argument, why democracy needs the humanities. The humanities and arts provide skills that are essential to keep democracy healthy. Thirsty for national profit, nations and their systems of education are heedlessly discarding skills that are needed to keep democracies alive. If this trend continues, nations all over the world will soon be producing generations of useful machines rather than complete citizens who can think for themselves, criticize tradition, and understand the significance of another person's sufferings and achievements. The future of the world's democracies hangs in the balance. And also, democracies have great rational and imaginative powers. They are also prone to some serious flaws in reasoning, to parochialism, haste, sloppiness, selfishness, narrowness of the spirit. Education based mainly on profitability in the global market magnifies these deficiencies, producing a greedy obtuseness and a technically trained docility that threatens the very life of democracy and the creation of a decent world culture. I think students also need to understand when they say, why should I take this course? I think we shouldn't be ashamed to say, because this is part of how we learn to be democratic citizens. And secondly, a quote from Michael Roth. I think this book is also very helpful. He says, this is why a liberal education matters. A good university should encourage engagement with communities outside the university as guides, not judges. That's really important. Guides, not judges. We faculty can show our students how to engage in the practice of exploring objects, norms, and values that inform diverse cultures. Through this engagement, students will develop the ability to converse with others about shaping the objects, norms, and values that will inform their own lives. They will develop the ability not merely to criticize values, but to add value to the organizations in which they participate. Guided by a liberal education, they will increase their ability to find together ways of living that have meaning and direction. This is why liberal education matters far beyond the university. And then he goes on to say that the goals of a strong university should rest on the hope that the thoughtful inquiry sparked by liberal education will enable diverse communities to overcome more of their blindness to one another and to the problems they and we share. The value of a good education isn't just about landing one's first job. It emerges over the course of one's working life. Liberal education matters far beyond the university because it increases our capacity to understand the world, contribute to it, and reshape our lives. When it works, it never ends. Okay, so that is the foundation for everything that I do. And I want to now explain how I apply this in two different formats. I very much share the goals that Nussbaum and Roth promote. These skills that I want students to learn include the ability to explain ideas to others, thoughtfully listen to other people, and think analytically about whether the claims of a public speaker or a writer seem credible. And this is why engagement with public discourse is essential. So I teach both first-year seminars and upper-level seminars, one of which might now be adapted to communicating beyond Carolina. And these students these courses require students to read primary sources and historical narratives about people in the past and past events. One of these courses, freshman seminar, focuses on travel writing and Americans who have lived abroad and how that experience has changed the way they understand their own culture, their own values, their own identities. And I ask the students in these classes, each class, someone has to do a commentary on an author to explain the weaknesses and strengths of the book, to bring some kind of clarity and analytical insight to the text. But more importantly, I require every student to take a trip, just like a traveler going to Paris or to London or to Rome, but they have to go to some place they have not gone before. And we have at Carolina Public Humanities a series every week at Flyleaf Books, in which faculty members and others join in conversations about key issues. This is a talk by our colleague Andy Reynolds, former colleague, I guess now at Political Science Department, speaking about gay office holders and how they develop political skills. And we had a whole panel of people here. These are office holders, gay community leaders. And so students have to attend events like this. This is just one of many, many kinds of events. And then write a descriptive analytical account, noting something new or surprising they encountered, something they hadn't known before, and reflect analytically about encounters with previously unknown information or viewpoints. In other words, how they are thinking about something beyond their comfort zone. And I think this has been an extremely valuable travel experience for my students. Secondly, we have created at Carolina Public Humanities a program called the Maynard Adams Fellows for the Public Humanities, in which every year we have at least 10 graduate students from different departments, including philosophy, history, English, American studies, religious studies, etc. And they meet every month for a seminar conversation over dinner. We had to do it on Zoom this year, of course, in which they talk about how engagement with the world beyond the university is essential for their work as scholars and as teachers. And in order to help them understand how this experience might become integrated into their professional lives, they are each asked to develop a public program with partners at a community college or in the public schools or a public library or sometimes at a retirement community. And in this program, they put together people with different points of view. They encourage interactive conversation with the audience. And they are given the task of thinking about how their work can lead to a public conversation, public discourse. And the goal is to help them recognize that public engagement and public discourse are key aspects of academic work, and whatever they do in academia, beyond academics, they need to understand how to engage the public. And this means understanding how to offer diverse perspectives and expertise on complex issues. So I'm constantly impressed by the ways in which these graduate students want to engage with public audiences and contribute to public discourse, because I think what it tells us is the humanities are moving far beyond the university and contributing to the skills and conversations that sustain a democratic society. So what is the key point? I want to grade students, I want to evaluate students, and I want to encourage students at every level, from a first-year seminar to graduate school, to recognize that they need to analyze old ideas and new ideas by speaking clearly about public issues. And I try to encourage students at all of these levels to be deeply engaged with the meaning, diversity, and power of public discourse. So what is the real takeaway? It's not whether they get an A or a B in the course. The real takeaway is that they must learn that speaking publicly and listening to the speech of others is essential for lifelong participation in diverse communities and democratic societies. This, by the way, is Martha Nussbaum speaking at a Carolina Public Humanities Symposium about 4 years ago. And a lot of these people are students as well as members of the community. In other words, we try to practice what we preach. And I will stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Lloyd. That was great. And next up, do we have Kelly or Michael? I don't even know anymore. Kelly, okay. Take it away, Kelly.
Hi, everyone. So as Lloyd talked a little bit more about the why, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the how. And I've been really, as I said earlier, if you were here before we got started with the first session, I was really interested in inclusive facilitation. And just a quick anecdote, I was asked to serve on a jury for a pretty serious criminal case a few years ago. And another colleague suggested that I volunteer for four person. And it seemed like quite a challenge, but to me, it was a challenge to see how my classroom facilitation skills would work in a really important setting. And I can tell you that it worked pretty well to use some of the skills I had. So I want to share with you some of the things that I think about when I think about facilitation. So let me, okay, so let me start by throwing out a question to you. Should a deaf couple be allowed to genetically screen embryos for implantation that will lead to offspring who are also deaf? So this is the kind of question that you can imagine maybe being asked in a biology classroom. And you can imagine what just happened here is what happens in a classroom. There's a lot of silence and a lot of looking, and it doesn't go the way we might have this imagination of how this could be a really lively discussion. So let's do this another way. Let's consider that same question. An instructor poses this question to a whole class to introduce genetic testing. Why might this not work well? So I'm going to give you a minute of silence to think and write in the chat without hitting enter. And I want you to consider some reasons why this might not work well. Maybe around student diversity and inclusion and why students might not speak up, the nature of the question, maybe the mode of asking the question. So anything that you want to think about around that. So go ahead and type into the chat, but don't hit enter. And then when I say go, we'll look at all of the answers. So I'll read a few of them out. A student in the class is deaf, afraid of how others might perceive responses. The question is jarring without a great deal of context, motivation, and sensitive setup by the teacher. Absolutely. Students might have a sense of if the instructor's looking for the right answer, right? They're worried about being right or wrong. They're worried about offending other people. Lack of anonymity, not comfortable sharing their own opinions. Worry that I might only speak up about my side, uncertainty, no one wants the wrong answer. So we're starting to see some of the same themes coming out. Donna down here says implication issues around disability rights, women's autonomy, prejudices may come into play. Really great ideas, okay? So I wanna explore, even though this I think is the way a lot of instructors attempt to move into a discussion, I wanna think about ways to break it down a little bit differently. And you've come up with some really good reasons why we might want to do that. So I've populated some ideas here, and a lot of them came up in your themes already as well. So around student diversity and inclusion, I need time to think, right? It is really hard, especially for introverts, to jump into something like this. They need some quiet time. And so I'm really a proponent of silence in the classroom, like I just did with you. I just moderate a minute of silence. I'm not comfortable stating my ideas and viewpoints, especially if they're the minority viewpoints and a student doesn't know if they are or not. You said this, is the professor looking for a correct answer, right? And the professor is the person in power in this classroom, right? So you may not want to give the wrong answer to the professor. I have a disability and I'm not sure how this conversation will proceed, so I think I'll wait. I don't know how people will react and if they will attack me for what I've said, right? So there is a real fear, not just for being wrong, but then potentially the consequences of saying something wrong with their peers. The nature of the question, right? It was actually a yes/no question, which isn't the greatest way to get conversation. Do the students have any background information around the science of genetic screening, deafness, policy, religion, to provide nuanced perspectives? This probably seems really logical as I say it, but sometimes we throw questions where the students just don't have anything to say because they don't have enough background to say something. And the prompt seems to ask for a personal opinion, which can stifle initial conversation, right? So somebody said you didn't provide that sensitive warm up in some way. And then the mode of asking a question, right? There's something in education we call the consolidation of responsibility. Someone else will answer it, right? I don't need to because someone else will. And some of the research around this says, regardless of class size, typically 5 to 8 people will account for 75 to 95% of the comments made in a discussion. So it's easy to be deceived into thinking that you've helped facilitate a great conversation when in reality, you had a great discussion with 5 students while the majority were spectators. And this comes out of a really nice advice guide on how to hold a class discussion by Jay Howard, which is in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I think verbal questions need to have a verbal response instantaneously. So you have to be a quick thinker and you have to say something eloquent right away. That's an assumption people will make. I think many students may need a warm up before jumping into a question like this, especially because it's a pretty serious and personal question. So that's really what I want to think about today and the perspective I want to bring. So if we think about this whole class discussion and discourse as the entree, then I think we need some appetizers to get warmed up with. So I'm Italian, so here's a nice appetizer tray. But I'm Italian, so we do lots of appetizer trays. Don't fill up on all the appetizers. So let's break this down a little bit. And I really like to model some things as I go. As I said, I'm the Associate Dean of Instructional Innovation. So I really think it's important to model and really solidify the ideas. So I'm going to ask you to go into breakout groups for 3 minutes. And I'm going to ask you to discuss a type of appetizer activity you could do for students, but before the main entree. And the main entree is going to be this whole class discussion that might be somewhat controversial. It doesn't have to be the one I just proposed. And this warm-up activity could occur before or even during class. And then the second part, how will you collect evidence of engagement and thinking from every student from this type of activity? So this gets at that like grading and evaluation piece, right? It doesn't have to be a whole paper or something big. So what's something small you might be able to collect? Why don't we see if maybe we can get 2 volunteers to share 1 or 2 ideas that came out of this? Maybe just raise your digital hand. Great, Susan.
Well, I came right out with going to high school in London, Ohio, and that turned out to make me the foreigner, the farthest away. Kevin and Martin and I came up with 2 things. And one was activity where just asking students about what they already know about the topic, in this case, genetic testing. And then it would kind of normalize, like people have different levels of knowledge about it. But Kevin had a really good idea, which was, or at least I thought it was a good idea, which was asking them to talk about when did they first become aware of deafness, like the idea that some people couldn't hear. Did they have a memory of when they first became aware of it? And we didn't get to the second part about how we would find evidence of engagement.
Okay, great, thank you. And I saw another hand. Let's go with Melinda.
Okay, So it was just Lloyd and I, and since I went to high school in Fresno, California, I got the pick. So we talked about making sure students were coming from, because students come with different backgrounds, to try to understand that first, to get them in a place of common knowledge, which I think is similar to what was said earlier. So I gave an example of, I have a food course where I have activists from the community come in and talk about issues around food. And we had, in one in particular that stood out was a woman came in and talked about trying to get more Black farmers and her activism around that role. And then and when students had to reflect on it, I had students that said, well, maybe Black people just don't want to farm. And so then I realized at that point that I didn't do the work ahead of time to let them know why there aren't Black farmers. You know, there were all these policies put in place that restricted Black farming, and this is, you know, and so they didn't. So I think doing the work, the appetizer beforehand, so when community activists come into our classes, the students understand where they're coming from.
Great. Those are both two really great examples, and I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper and touch on that a little bit. I want to invite anybody else to put anything in the chat that are some practical ideas that came out, and we're probably going to see some overlap as I walk through a few slides now. So one thing that actually came out of our discussion with Donna Gillespie was like, well, isn't there something you could be doing in the first few days of the semester that would sort of set this up? Do you have to do a warm up for every activity? And I do think a warm up for every activity is a useful exercise, but early in the semester, I would say we do need to have these appetizers, right? We need to set the ground rules and expectations about discussions. We need to maybe have a discussion about discussions, including the importance of active listening and how participation and engagement will be evaluated. So these are things we can do very early on. And I would also note, if we value active listening, then we should not penalize listeners for participation in this way. So for example, I've seen classes and I've been in classes where it's like, if you raise your hand, you get a point. And if you're not the kind of person to raise your hand and talk, you get penalized for that. And I think that's counter to what we're trying to do. So providing a lot of ungraded feedback is a way around that. It can be encouraging and inviting, but I think there's a lot we can do to collect evidence of learning and thinking from every student, even if they're not speaking aloud. These are some things that came out of the Communication Beyond Carolina guide that we're working on from Kevin. Just skim the list really quickly, but it's the kinds of things that you can set as ground rules and guidelines with students early in the semester. And I would really say it's important to have students build this list with you so that they take some ownership and pride in how these discussions are going to go. So let's say we're warming up to an activity like I just showed you, but maybe something you're thinking about in your own discipline. It's really important to plan pre-class work before that, right? So assign students to read about this topic, which is something Melinda was just talking about, with a few specific prompts. We could require a submission through a homework system. It could just be a paragraph, but then we've got some evidence that all students are thinking, can even just give it a check mark. Don't have to grade it. No need to hide the activity, include the questions you'll discuss during class so students can prepare, right? Those people that need time to think. During class, we can also have students answer anonymous polls, perhaps anonymously to the class, but not to you, so you can track engagement and participation. Once again, this is really just a check mark that students are engaged. We can ask students to work in small groups to answer the prompt. Ask them each to write the response in a Google document or a paper. Collecting this provides evaluation that students are engaged and thinking. And then the jigsaw method is another one where people may take on a role or a view and work with students that have that similar idea, and then you put them in varying groups, which is called the jigsaw method. And it allows them to really learn something deeply and then have to share and convince or teach others. And then the main entree, if there is one, right? So thinking about some large conversation. Once again, we want to start by reminding students of the guidelines of discussion. Maybe they're posted somewhere in the classroom. As the facilitator setting expectations for the specific discussion and reasoning, you might say something like, keep your comments to a few sentences, because if you say keep them short, that means something different to different people. And you may say, if I signal you to end your comment, it's because I want to hear from a diverse group of students. I think it's really important to encourage diverse voices. A lot of students are just not confident that they want to speak up. So maybe as simple as let's hear from someone we haven't heard from yet. But I think a good way to encourage students that are feeling a little shy for whatever reason about this is to respond to pre-class work and let the students know you really liked what they had to say and would they share them. Another idea is to go around the room, sometimes called serial testimony or whip around, where each student speaks, but then also allowing students the opportunity to pass is a really important thing. I think it's important to periodically take polls to get the pulse of the whole group, and then consider pausing the conversation. So everyone, including you, can stop and write and reflect, which I think is really important if the conversation gets heated or a microaggression was realized. And I just think silence is a really important tool, and there's nothing wrong with calling for a minute of silence to gather yourself as the teacher. And then I know I'm running out of time. So just lastly, dessert, never skip it. Evaluation, right? And it's a great way to have students reflect, but you can collect it. It can be the muddiest point, what remains unclear, what questions do you have now? They could answer the same prompt as a discussion point before and after class, and you can see how their views have become more nuanced or changed or clarified. Discussion board posts, assignments, once again, they can just be a check mark. And then summary assignments, they might be like a higher stakes type of thing that help them see how you're going to be grading when it is a higher stakes assessment. So a practice prompt maybe. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Excellent. Great job, Kelly. That was terrific. And I figured out who's going third. Now, Michael, I believe that leaves you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen so I can get started. I'm including in the chat a link to a shared folder where there'll be some resources that I'll make reference to. So feel free to go ahead and open that link so everyone can see the presentation, I take it. Okay, so thanks so much. I've really enjoyed listening to Lloyd and Kelly's remarks, and I think there's a lot of overlap and mutual interest here. So I teach in the philosophy department here at UNC and direct the outreach program in philosophy and at the Parr Center for Ethics. I'm excited to focus on how we can sort of introduce discursive practices in the classroom. By way of background, my interest in this and some of my thinking about this is influenced by work in political philosophy, especially from kind of deliberative conceptions of democracy, and in the philosophy of education, especially on moral and civic education. It's also influenced and informed by service learning and outreach efforts to promote ethical and philosophical reflection beyond Carolina. So my remarks are going to come in two parts about how we can effectively facilitate, assess, evaluate discourse in the classroom. The first part is about taxonomizing discourse, and the second part is about sort of concrete activities and assignments we can bring to the classroom. So I think it's really important that before we answer the question how we can assess and facilitate discourse, we think about what discursive activity we're engaged in. Discourse comes in many different shapes and sizes. I'm going to offer kind of a limited taxonomy. I don't think we should expect precision from any given taxonomy, and I don't think we should use them in a kind of gatekeeping way to say, "Well, that's not properly dialogue, that's not proper deliberation," and so on. But nonetheless, it's a kind of helpful tool for kind of training the eye and ear of a teacher to hone in on and isolate kind of particular features of classroom discussion, which is otherwise a kind of really noisy phenomenon. There's a lot going on, and in order to sort of facilitate it effectively, it helps to have a taxonomy in hand. So here's one such taxonomy. Of course, these examples overlap in interesting and fruitful ways. So dialogue, debate, conversation, deliberation. A lot of my thinking about deliberative pedagogy is informed by work in the philosophy of education on dialogue, known as the community of inquiry framework. And so they overlap in all sorts of ways and mutually inform one another. But it is worth noting that at least in some of their kind of pure or ideal forms, each of these have somewhat different aims and norms that kind of govern them. So for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to focus on deliberation. That's not because I think deliberation is the only discursive activity apt for the classroom. I actually think it's a substantive and interesting pedagogical question to think at any given time what form of discourse is appropriate for the task at hand. So deliberation is itself sort of a coarse-grained notion. One way to delimit it from other nearby ways of engaging in discourse is to think about its core aim. Here's one common way to think about that core aim. Deliberation is fundamentally concerned with answering the question, what should we or I do? There's a kind of practical character to deliberation. Not all deliberation is about binary choices or dilemmas, but I think deliberation is an important but not totally common human activity. We're generally an autopilot. We deliberate when we confront a practical problem or a puzzle, either individually or collectively. That's the activity we engage in when we confront them. Deliberation consists in weighing alternative courses of action, considering salient values and principles, weighing trade-offs and risks and benefits, and then ultimately coming to some kind of decision. So I think to understand how we can promote deliberation among students in the classroom, it's important to think of it as a norm-governed activity. So just like it, you might say what it is to play a particular game is to follow X, Y, and Z rules. What it is to deliberate, this kind of conversational activity distinct from others, is to follow a certain set of kind of conversational norms and features. Here's why I think it's really important to articulate these norms. And it's a useful classroom exercise to collectively with your students articulate them for yourselves, actually. One is you need to know what game you're playing at any given time. So for a teacher, that's to know how to design and facilitate and assess any given assignment or activity. And for students, that's for them to know at any given time, what are they expected to be doing and what are they doing? The other kind of important reason to articulate them is you need to know what the norms are in order to create the right kind of classroom culture in which the kind of activities and assignments you have in mind are set up for success. So I do think there's an important distinction between classroom activities and assignments on the one hand, and kind of the classroom culture and ethos on the other. And I don't think, in a lot of cases, no amount of clever assignment or activity design will suffice to kind of make that part of the class more deliberative, more inclusive, more egalitarian, whatever it might be, if it's not situated in a kind of carefully curated classroom culture that has those features or promotes them or is conducive to them. So that's why I think actually a lot of our energy on answering the how question, how to facilitate and evaluate, can be spent on just thinking about course design, classroom culture, and norms at this kind of higher level. Here's kind of one picture of what deliberation looks like. As I say, I think it's a useful exercise to work with your students to articulate these, collaboratively. So deliberation, I think, is on one picture collaborative. It's not an adversarial team sport where you know what side you're on before you enter the conversation. It's not an attempt to convert another person to your view through some combination of rational or irrational means. In fact, I think it's important that if deliberation is going to be truly responsive, mutually responsive, both parties come into it in principle, or all parties, open to transforming their view or preferences and so on. That's why I think deliberation is intelligent in a way that just like polling people and taking their votes wouldn't be. Rather than just taking our views and preferences for granted, deliberation seeks to transform them, seeks to educate them and inform them. I think exchanges within deliberation in the classroom should be sincere. That is, folks should stand behind what they say. With the interesting caveat, I think, that one of the kind of attractive features of deliberation that political philosophers and others have noted is that when we deliberate in a public and social way, that has a tendency to incentivize and kind of draw out public-spirited reasons and kind of pro-social reasons. People are much less inclined to have a kind of narrowly self-interested view on an issue. It helps people take a broader view, but it ought to be sincere. They're kind of utterances in the deliberation. I think good reasons within a deliberation minimize disagreement and try to find common ground, offer justifications that are intelligible to your interlocutors. The output of deliberation is provisional and always subject to revision. You don't know what the course of a deliberation in the classroom is going to be. This is in some ways something scary from a teacher's point of view. The conversations are contingent depending on what one person says, and if it's genuinely mutually responsive, it'll take a different course depending on what person says. You don't know in advance where the deliberation is going to take you, so that's not predetermined. So, I mean, at least two upshots for teachers and just thinking about these norms is knowing them can help you imagine your course assignments and activities as a kind of progression of skill acquisitions and aptitudes. And I think half the battle really here in thinking about pedagogical strategies is about creating the conditions for the success of those assignments and more concrete strategies that I'll mention now. So I'll present some examples of in-class kind of activities and assignments that can be used. My thinking is informed heavily by a program we offer here at the Parr Center for Ethics at UNC, the National High School Ethics Bowl. There's a number of other sort of deliberative programs like this: structured academic controversy, national issues forums, deliberative opinion polls. There's many examples, all of which share, in my view, a kind of common pedagogical interest in creating a certain kind of environment where there can be a dialectical and extended give and take conversation between students involved. So the question I've given myself in this part with the three examples I'll give you is, short of just doing a full-blown deliberation like an ethics bowl or a debate or any of those other examples, what can you do to incorporate that into your classroom? So here's strategy number one. It consists in incorporating deliberative elements into written assignments, which are kind of the bread and butter of many, many classes. So here's two ways to do that. One is to assign students an ethics memo. This is a kind of nonverbal way of still creating an opportunity or an assignment that's got a kind of public facing and social character to it. So the memo, you might sort of frame it as a professional memo addressed to peers and colleagues on some difficult question that arises in professional practice. I did this with educational leaders in the context of a graduate school of education course on ethics education. And I'm happy to say more about exact parameters and criteria and guidelines I've provided, but it's got to be clearly and succinctly written and have a kind of social facing character. Another idea is to have students write their own case study, ethical or normative case study. So those come in many different shapes and sizes, depends on the discipline, depends on the topic. But I think good cases share a couple features in common, and those features kind of recommend this as an assignment. One is a good case tells a story about that makes clear what the practical problem is, what the puzzle is that needs resolving. Why is this of interest deliberatively at all? A good case invites us to move past quibbling and disagreeing about facts in order to get at perhaps kind of underlying value judgments that might underlie our disagreements, or that might be fueling the kind of practical puzzle in the first place. And then there's the pedagogical value of a student writing a case study, coming to think of an issue from multiple perspectives that helps them see that on many issues, folks can earnestly, with all the same facts before them, disagree. And some people call that phenomenon reasonable disagreement. And there's some opportunity for students to see that. I've included in the shared folder a resource around research and writing case studies. The second strategy consists in kind of isolating features of a deliberation or a dialectical exchange and just using kind of one-off activities or kind of more modular strategies. So, the subject matter can be about a case study. It can be about anything that's already sort of showing up in the course content. I'm, in the interest of time, just going to talk about two of these four that are listed for you here. So here's the first one. It's based on the question formulation technique, a kind of well-known strategy used by teachers that involves generating, sorting, and discussing questions. So a really useful thing for students to do is to reflect on the meaningful difference between questions. So some questions are more controversial than others. Some questions require more or less research to answer. Some would be answered by the empirical sciences. Some are more normative or ethical in nature. Just reflecting on the differences between questions is valuable. It's also a nice way to kind of crowdsource a task question that can then be used on for an assignment or for a discussion later in the course. So one way the process could go with question generation is the students read a case, then they verbalize as many questions as they can, all the questions that come to mind without stopping to discern or refine any of them. And then the explicit kind of discussion about the questions happens. You have a discussion about, well, which of these questions are normative or descriptive? How controversial are these on a kind of scale? Which of these are open that is, require a long-winded answer of some kind, or closed, which can be answered with a simple yes or no, and so on. And then you might ask them to prioritize the questions. Which questions are the ones you must answer to offer a satisfactory solution to the practical problem at hand? And then have a kind of meta-reflective discussion about why they made those kinds of decisions, the sorting and prioritizing decisions that they did. Another strategy, I'll jump all the way to the right here, is ethical toolkit. Unlike the other three, this is a more kind of didactic strategy rather than an interactive one. And the basic idea here is that it's really important to give students a conceptual vocabulary with which to make sense of a problem, with which to disagree about a problem, and with which to converse about it. So by pairing course content or something on the syllabus with ethical notions like well-being, respect, responsibility, you're equipping your students to kind of have a shared vocabulary to talk about the issue. So you'll notice in the folder that I linked to, I actually included a sample arrangement germane to the example Kelly mentioned. So there's an ethics case study about selecting for deafness, paired with some kind of canonical notions that are ethical in nature, like well-being, harm, and autonomy, with a sample kind of prompt that the student might see in the class, maybe in an upper level science class in the context of learning about PGD, the kind of phenomenon of genetic selection that's being discussed. Happy to say more about the middle two that I skipped, and I think there's a kind of whole repertoire of activities that just involve isolating features of the deliberative process, and I'd welcome more discussion about that. The very last thing that I'll put on the table here, the third strategy, is a kind of hybrid of the other two, and it involves thinking about a certain kind of inquiry or deliberation as happening over time, over the course of multiple assignments, over the course of weeks, and so on. And it talk to text approach, where you start the entire class on an inquiry by presenting them with kind of a specific practical problem that can guide the investigation. They work through the problem in smaller groups, a little bit like the way Kelly has kind of set out for us. They get warmed up intellectually and sort of get used to speaking and deliberating with one another. And then you might have a kind of full-fledged in-class deliberative exercise of some kind, followed by an opportunity for individual assessment and writing a kind of ethics memo where they take in the direction that they see fit, the opportunity for like a capstone reflection on what they've done, and write a kind of memo. And again, happy to talk about specific parameters and guidelines I've used in class. But with that, please keep in touch. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to speaking with you all, and yeah, thanks again.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. Leave it to the philosopher to identify the taxonomy. I think that was really helpful. And it also reminds me to clarify something. So I referred to this symposium as a symposium on deliberative pedagogy, but in reality, in using Michael's vocabulary, which I perfectly agree with, this is really a symposium about discursive pedagogy. And deliberation is one component of that, but there are certainly others. So thank you all of you for great presentations. And I know we're running out of time, but I'm happy to extend this panel to say 12:05, which will leave about 10 minutes of questions. And then we can depart for lunch. But if you need to go before then, you're certainly welcome to. So please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. But I'm happy to start off because I'm curious, Kelly, two themes that came up in your presentation. On one hand, there's the need for inclusion, and on the other hand, there's a need not to punish folks who perhaps are more introverted and less likely to contribute in a traditional sense. And I'm curious how you navigate the tension between those two things. How do we create an inclusive dialogue without punishing folks that perhaps aren't as ready to contribute?
Yeah, so I think it's about having a variety of modes that students can engage in. Even like today, we're using the chat, right? And people using the chat may also be speaking up, right? But both modes are ways that we're including people. So I don't think they're actually two ends, right? I think you think about diversity, which is a real strength, and you think about all the different people you have in the classroom. You just need to think about how would that person engage. And for me, there are lots of ways to think about diversity in a classroom. But honestly, if you think about introverts and extroverts, you will have hit many other types of ways that students feel reticent for jumping into a conversation. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Thank you. Yeah, Graham, this is a colleague of mine from Davidson College. Welcome.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for including me today. And it's been great to hear all these great ideas and panelists. As Kevin knows, I'm the faculty director of the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative down here at Davidson. And we're working on a lot of similar challenges and questions. I actually had a question for Kelly. I loved your food metaphor as lunch approaches. And this, particularly the dessert metaphor of evaluation being dessert. And I'm curious, because that's a little bit counterintuitive, I think both for us as faculty and for students. So how have you, or ideas you have to make evaluation assessment, less like a vegetable, like a really good vegetable, and more like a dessert that people actually want to do and want to look forward to do it.
Yeah, you've taken the analogy probably even deeper than I meant it to be, but I think evaluation is actually at all stages, right? Anytime you collect evidence that students are thinking is evaluation, right? It's called formative evaluation, and it doesn't have to be something that is even graded. But I personally think that as students really engage deeply in this kind of conversation, that they'll realize, we always say, like, the more educated you become, the more you realize you don't know, right? And I think it's fun to be in a conversation where it goes deeper and deeper, and then you realize you do have a lot to say, and you want to share that in some way. So I think the discussion boards after can be a lot of fun, and you may have to set some structure around them, right? They may have to make a post. They may have to respond once, right? In some ways to make this a good discussion and to make sure you can evaluate it. But I think a good discussion, like any kind of good learning, becomes scaffolded. There's the before, the during, and the after. And I think if it's gone really well, the students should want to engage. If you want to take that dessert analogy to its sweetness metaphor.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great.
Other thoughts or questions? And they don't have to be questions necessarily. They could be your own contributions or ideas for strategies that you use in the classroom. I saw a hand go up and then someone, yeah, John.
Unless somebody else had a hand up, if I'm the only one, I'll go for it.
Yeah, go for it.
I guess, and I kind of wanted to go back to where you ended, Lloyd, where you said, I think many of us agree, it's not about whether the student gets an A or a B, it's about sort of the learning that's being done. And yet here we are, LDoc was yesterday. Many of us are spending our days over the next few days grading. And I was just curious for any one of you, like if you could be even more specific about like techniques for actually translating the measurement of how well students have done or how what work students still need to do towards achieving those learning goals, and just especially to offer advice for anyone who might be in the midst of trying to actually grade participation, dialogue, and the such.
I do think one of the challenges that I know I face, I assume most people face, we stress some kind of class participation, especially in a seminar, as an important component. And it is true that helps the extrovert more. So the question is, can we find ways, for example, if I'm evaluating a a student's reaction paper to an experience, a new experience, like that they've encountered and really thought about. Can I assess that as their form of thoughtful participation that goes beyond the fact that they didn't speak so much in class? I mean, that is a challenge to broaden my conception of what participation looks like. And it can take many forms of writing and speaking, in my case.
And I would echo everything Lloyd just said. I mean, I generally, John, if the challenge that you presented was, can we get as precise and granular about participation as we might be able to with other kinds of assignments and such? I think I'm willing to sort of just say no, and I think that's part comes along with what Lloyd just said. You know, if we're willing to think expansively about modes of participation, kinds of participation, you know, the student moving from A to B wherever they started, I think that just implies that we're going to lose some of the granularity you might get when it comes to grading problem sets. If you expect that level of precision, it probably won't come. But I sympathize with this kind of the agony of trying to evaluate participation specifically in this more numerical, quantified sort of way, rather than just, at a more general level.
I'll throw in a few ideas. If you're using polling in the classroom, then I think if students were to put in a poll, then they've engaged. If you wanted to grade those for their answers, you could, but we also talked about maybe there is no right and wrong answer, right? So participation is the engagement and the thinking and what they've offered. I think discussion boards, once again, you know, you can get some measure of participation, or you can take content out of there. Maybe you have students peer review in some way where they're writing a reflection about what was just said or written. And it doesn't have to be that their ideas are your ideas in that peer review, but they've engaged in it. So I think the more small assessments we can have where students get these little check marks and some feedback from you, that's the goal of assessment. It's not really that we all enjoy giving these big grades at the end. They should be for learning, and all the times we can give feedback on these small assessments, the better.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That was great presentations and a great discussion.